Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Tommy Lucchese, the man whose intelligence and diplomacy helped shape one of New York's most powerful families. Known for his charm, precision, and quiet confidence, Lucchese ruled not with fear, but with respect and understanding. Before we begin, like this video, we're aiming for 100 likes in this video. And share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, close your eyes and let the story of Tommy Lucchese guide you into the night. He began far from Manhattan's towers, born Gaetano Lucchese on the 1st of December 1899 in Palermo, Sicily. Family came before everything, as it often did in that place and time. His parents sought steadier work across the ocean, a path many took when the old country offered too little. Around 1911, they landed in New York and settled in East Harlem, where Italian, Irish, and Jewish families lived side by side amid pushcarts, coal smoke, and arguments over rent. The boy's name softened into Tommy, as schoolmates and street corners pressed English upon him. He adapted quickly, small, watchful, careful with words, traits that would serve him as the neighborhood's gray economy tugged at his sleeves. Early jobs were simple and tiring. Deliveries, errands, the kind of work where a kid learned which bosses paid on time, which ones lied, and which ones drank too much to notice a missing dollar. Temptation took clearer shape during Prohibition, when illegal liquor money washed through tenement hallways like rainwater under a door. Street crews formed and reformed. A clever kid could stash bottles, watch doors, relay messages, or count bets without drawing attention. Tommy wasn't the biggest. He didn't have to be. He excelled at being reliable. He remembered faces, settled small disputes, and kept promises. That quiet reliability opened important doors, not to glamorous rooms, but to back offices where plans formed and percentages were divided. Trouble still found him young. In 1921, a judge convicted him of auto theft, a charge that reflected the era's common hustle to strip and resell cars or use them for quick jobs. He served a bit more than a year, long enough to learn how to keep his head down in hard places. Sing Sing taught lessons no textbook offered. Guards respected order, inmates respected silence, and anyone who ran his mouth too freely paid for it. He walked out in 1922 with a new level of caution and a deeper understanding that power favored the man who didn't need to shout. Around this time, a workplace accident scarred his right hand, removing 2 fingers and altering his grip forever. Cops later called him Three-Finger Brown, a nod to the famous pitcher with a similar injury. The nickname stuck, though Tommy never liked it. He turned the misfortune into camouflage, adopting the plain alias Thomas Brown when it suited him, a name as ordinary as a brown hat in a crowded subway car. The injury also gave him a tool he didn't expect. People remembered the hand more than his face, and while they stared, he watched their eyes. After prison, he gravitated toward Gaetano Reyna, a steady Bronx and East Harlem figure who oversaw bootlegging, gambling, and protection schemes with a controlled temperament. Reyna was older, cautious, and respected. His crew liked order, and whenever possible, profit without fireworks. Tommy, fit. He started as a helper, then a runner, then a man trusted to hold cash and deliver messages. He disliked wasted motion. If 2 crews wanted the same corner, he found the schedule where both could eat. If a shipment looked risky, he proposed a quieter route. He focused on numbers, games, small loans with steep terms, and liquor distribution, always preferring fixed income to showy jackpots. Reyna's outfit had neighbors Gaetano Gagliano and others who shared a taste for calm profit. Through them, Tommy met men who would shape the American underworld in the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds. Charles Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky among them. He liked their modern approach. Instead of rigid old country feuds, these men prized business logic. Stay efficient. Share with partners who perform. Avoid fights that burn money. Tommy absorbed it all. He shed formality when it got in the way, kept rituals when they helped maintain trust, and learned to sit at tables with rivals who spoke different languages but understood arithmetic. Prohibition made fortunes, yet it also sharpened knives. Joe, the boss. Masseria tried to hold New York's Italian underworld in his fist, while the Castellammarese faction, linked to Salvatore Maranzano, pushed back. The struggle that followed, later called the Castellammarese War, turned quiet streets tense. Reina himself was murdered in 1930 after whispers he might switch sides. Historians often point to Masseria's camp as the initiator. In the chaos that followed, Masseria placed Joseph Pinzolo over Reina's old crew, a move many in East Harlem resented. Within months, Pinzolo was shot dead in a Broadway office. Investigators suspected men loyal to the old Reina circle took part. Tommy's name appeared in rumors, reports, and private police notes, though no court ever proved his role. The killing showed something vital about him. While others chased spotlight, he stayed off stage and let the room assume what it wished. Prosecutors struggled to pin paper to a ghost. The larger war ended in 1931 with two shocks. Joe Masseria was assassinated at a Coney Island meal, a turning point that most historians link to Luciano's maneuvering to end the old boss's reign. Later that year, Maranzano, briefly the city's new paramount leader, was also murdered, clearing space for a modern structure that avoided a single dictator. Luciano and allies created a board eventually known as the Commission to prevent ruinous feuds and divide cities and industries in a way that kept money flowing. 5 families took shape in New York under this plan. Gaetano Gagliano, an ally from the Bronx and East Harlem, assumed leadership of the old Reina wing. For his deputy and principal organizer, he chose Tommy Lucchese. Elevated to underboss, Tommy focused on 2 pillars he knew cold: labor and logistics. He understood that factories did not run without steady trucking, and that union rules could halt shipments faster than any patrol car. The Garment District, a dense rectangle of dressmakers, coat factories, and jobbers in Midtown, became his focus. He cultivated foremen and union officials who could steer contracts or call surprise work stoppages. He nudged owners toward labor peace agreements that came with steady, quiet payments. Trucking firms signed up with approved associations that delivered protection from strikes and pilferage. Those who refused discovered delays, missing goods, or a payroll headache until they reconsidered. This was extortion and racketeering, but it wore a business suit. Meetings looked like any Midtown negotiation. Coffee on a conference table, invoices in neat folders, promises phrased as suggestions. That surface normalcy helped him build a machine that lasted decades. The 1,930 seconds brought attention from prosecutors who had grown sick of graft in the clothing trades. Thomas E. Dewey rose to prominence targeting labor racketeers. Federal agents started watching the flow of cash that moved between dressmakers, trucking, warehouses, and the street. Tommy's name surfaced in background memos as a quiet organizer behind certain associations and clubs that skimmed dues or levied fees on every garment that left a loading dock. He kept out of the line of fire by delegating to energetic surrogates who carried the heat. When a foreman took a charge, the foreman went to court, not the man 2 steps above. When a union fixer landed in headlines, another fixer replaced him as if the city itself had sprouted a spare. Bootlegging faded after repeal in 1933, but Tommy didn't miss it. His group had already diversified into betting, loan sharking, and the river of garment cash that never dried. Illegal gambling parlors hummed in back rooms from East Harlem to the Bronx, with bookmaking operations that could handle horse racing wagers by telephone or messenger, buffered by layers of intermediaries. He also kept an interest in nightclubs and restaurants that covered meetings and cushioned profits with legitimate sales. When police raided a storefront, the higher levels stayed intact. The structure, so many buffers, so many fronts, made him hard to corner. All through this period, he practiced a consistent style: courtesy with subordinates, cordiality with union officers, polite distance with politicians who appreciated favors that didn't leave fingerprints. He cultivated relationships with businessmen who had families and mortgages. He presented himself as a solver of problems: deliveries on time, strikes resolved, theft reduced. The pitch was simple in tone, complicated in consequence. A factory that paid for calm learned quickly that skipping a week came with headaches. Not dramatic violence, which drew headlines, but a sudden rash of hassles that ate profits. A missing shipment, a scheduling mix-up, a rumor that a competitor got inventory first. Owners who balked sometimes found themselves isolated by accident, shut out of trucking services or facing late-night calls from anxious clients. This was control without theatrics. It worked. He did not operate alone. Allies sprouted in overlapping networks: Jewish labor racketeers who specialized in union manipulation, Italian crews who ran numbers from candy shops, and midtown fixers who could whisper into the right ear at City Hall. Tommy formed partnerships with figures like Louis Buchalter in the garment trades, sharing leverage while each maintained his own side. When Buchalter fell under Dewey's relentless pressure, and eventually went to the electric chair in 1944, the vacuum did not last. Tommy and his partners guided pieces of the old labor apparatus into their own orbit. Again, nothing noisy. He rarely took the obvious seat. He preferred the chair in the corner, where a man could see who came and went. Even so, arrests and grand jury subpoenas came with the territory. Tommy faced periodic rounds of questioning in the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds, tied to labor coercion, illicit gambling, and suspected involvement in murky killings from the Castellammarese era. Investigators floated his name in connection with the Pinzolo murder and a handful of other unsolved attacks. None of those allegations ripened into convictions. Witnesses grew foggy. Complainants moved away. Memories frayed. Some feared testifying. Others decided business had improved since they started paying for labor peace and opted not to provoke a storm. The absence of courtroom proof did not mean innocence. It meant careful planning, strict discipline, and an understanding that trails disappear when go-betweens keep their mouths shut. His reputation by the end of the 1,930 seconds rested on predictability. Crews that worked with him expected schedules met and promises kept. He enforced discipline inside his outfit not with public displays but with quiet demotions, lost opportunities, or, when necessary, permanent solutions handled far from public view. Writers later differed over which specific acts he authorized, so responsible accounts mark many events as alleged or suspected. What is clear is that violence under his system served a purpose and arrived without spectacle. He valued a city that went to work on time the next morning. New York's power map kept shifting as the decade closed. Lucky Luciano went to prison in 1936, altering the balance at the top. Frank Costello emerged as a voice for practical business methods. In that environment, Tommy strengthened relationships that would make his rise smoother in the long run. He continued as underboss to Gagliano, collected influence in the garment district, and expanded gaming and loans in the Bronx and East Harlem. He showed up where he added value at negotiation tables, not at ceremonies with photographers. He wore conservative suits, lived in a modest way compared to flashier peers, and made a habit of sending small gifts that built loyalty over time. A job for a nephew, a doctor's recommendation, a problem swept off a desk. Wartime and the years after World War II expanded shipping and manufacturing. More fabric moved through Manhattan than ever. More delivery trucks rumbled along 10th Avenue. Those currents fed his operations. He nudged his men into freight handling, warehouse guards, and insurance bargaining. Loan books fattened as returning servicemen opened businesses and occasionally borrowed from the wrong lender. He preferred fielding smart earners who caught trends early. If a promising industry grew near an airport or on a new highway, he sent a crew to smooth relations with union locals and service providers. The technique negotiated control of choke points remained constant, even as the geography changed. He also learned to anticipate pressure. When officials hinted at hearings, he trimmed exposure. He replaced a too visible fixer with a quieter one, added extra layers between himself and the cash, and let a sacrificial corporate shell go under if headlines got hot. He prided himself on not being the man a reporter could photograph easily. To many citizens, he was a name in the paper, perhaps a face glimpsed once in a courthouse corridor, a man of few public words. To the underworld, he was a patient tactician who disliked surprises. By the late 1,940 seconds, he had become indispensable to Gagliano and a vital figure in the New York Commission's daily business. He still played the long game, coalitions over tantrums, steady percentages over reckless grabs. His hand, damaged in youth, turned pages of balance sheets and restaurant menus. He tapped it lightly when a meeting dragged on too long. New York kept moving, and he kept it moving in the directions that served him best. An organizer of labor rackets, gambling, and loans who preferred to leave flamboyance to others while his influence thickened quietly, block by block, deal by deal. Before sunrise, the streets around 7th Avenue are dim and quiet, steam drifting from grates, a few hand trucks rattling on their way to the loading docks. A short man props open a diner door with his shoulder and steps inside, where the cook knows his order without asking. He glances at the window glass, as if it were a map. Long blocks of factories, spools of thread, crates labeled with destinations from Buffalo to Baltimore. He notes which foreman reads the paper with a furrowed brow, which driver counts tips twice, which accountant folds receipts too neatly. By the time the sun hits the top floors, he's already visited 3 offices, said little, and left each one calmer and more nervous at the same time. His name is spoken softly because people who work in those blocks prefer smooth days to loud ones. The person who guarantees smooth days doesn't need billboards. He never did. The late 1942nd suit him. The war is ending, orders pile up, and trucking schedules tighten like drumheads. Behind the scenes, Gaetano Gagliano is aging, more comfortable at home than in a booth. Routine decisions drift toward Tommy, who handles them with the same steady cadence he used when he ran errands as a teen. He reads ledgers, watches patterns, and tests new lieutenants in small ways. A man sent to collect receipts brings back the exact amount twice and a little extra the third time. Tommy notices and trades him to a minor post where temptation is low. Another man keeps punctual books and treats drivers fairly. Tommy promotes him and quietly makes him responsible for a line of warehouses near the West Side Highway. The lesson is constant. The operation is a machine. No gear should grind or squeal. Television turns crime into theater at the start of the next decade. In 1950 and 1951, Senator Estes Kefauver's hearings parade racketeers and fixers across living rooms from coast to coast. Viewers tune in the way they once read the funny pages. Familiar names show up in headlines. Union enforcers from the garment district sweat under lights. Bookmakers explain how numbers work, and then stop talking. When lawyers whisper in their ears, Tommy's name surfaces in print as a figure behind labor shakedowns and gambling networks. Subpoenas follow. He appears when ordered, speaks little, and invokes his rights when questions turn toward day-to-day business. Investigators describe him as polite, compact, neat, always careful with phrasing. They are convinced he is important. They struggle to prove which particular dollars pass through his hands. That's by design. Around 1951, Gagliano fades from the picture for good, whether by death or withdrawal into quiet retirement. Different accounts assign different dates, but the effect is the same. The men of the old Reina Gagliano crew look to Tommy as the natural successor, a leader who has been acting boss in all but name. He accepts without fanfare. The family he inherits, soon called the Lucchese family by press and police controls, betting parlors, loan books, and heavy influence in garment trucking and dressmakers' labor. He rearranges the structure without spectacle. The Bronx, East Harlem, and parts of Queens become neatly assigned zones. He spots managers who prefer percentage-driven thinking over bluster and places them where money moves with the least noise. He discourages large gatherings, favors short meetings with tight agendas, and insists that problems be fixed one notch below the level that draws citywide attention. Labor remains his anchor. The garment trades are built on deadlines, and those deadlines depend on smooth movement, from cutting rooms to sewing floors to shipping docks. He works with union officials and middlemen who understand how a whisper can avert a strike, or how a delay can remind an owner what calm is worth. Some of those middlemen include Johnny Diogardi, known widely as Johnny Dio, who becomes notorious for paper locals and sweetheart agreements that drain dues and steer contracts to friendly trucking outfits. Dio's name later burns across newspapers for reasons that go beyond simple labor tinkering. But at this stage, he is one of several figures who provide leverage in negotiations no one wants aired in public. The money that flows from these arrangements feeds Tommy's organization month after month. It is racketeering, and it is calculated to look like routine labor relations to anyone walking by. Politics cannot be avoided when unions and city permits are involved. He cultivates acquaintances in ward clubs, borough offices, and party committees. The relationships are transactional rather than glamorous. A campaign needs printing and trucks. A district leader needs a Brinkley last-minute haul. A local official wants a problem to disappear before an election. Favors move both ways. Investigative reporters sometimes point to these ties and question why certain factory inspections go soft, or why a trucking co-op gets a lease in a prime spot. Rarely does any report name Tommy directly. He doesn't place calls himself when a surrogate can do it. Another stream of money runs through illegal gambling. Policy and horse bets are placed in candy stores, back rooms, and social clubs from the Bronx to Brooklyn. He structures his wagering network with multiple layers so that a police raid lands on a harmless layer while the core continues operating. Again, no step-by-step orders are ever written down. Messages travel by trusted hands. When a game draws too much attention, it closes quietly, and another opens 2 blocks away. This is not chance, it is patient design. The middle 1,950 seconds bring the kind of scandal that turns the city's stomach. Victor Riesel, a labor columnist who writes about rackets and unions, is blinded in a sidewalk attack in 1956 after he leaves a radio studio. Public anger surges. Johnny Dio is quickly identified by authorities as the power behind the plot, charged, and later convicted in related cases involving corruption and perjury. Prosecutors and journalists set Dio within Tommy's shadow because of Dio's long work in garment locals and trucking, areas tied to the Lucchese sphere. Direct proof that Tommy ordered or even knew about the attack never emerges, and responsible accounts keep that distinction clear. Nevertheless, the blowback rattles the networks that keep garment money flowing and triggers a wave of arrests and grand juries. Tommy tightens procedures, drops exposed intermediaries, and urges his men to handle disputes without making newspapers into allies. He also reminds them that violence is a last resort and that headlines are poison to steady income. While reporters chase union scandals, another market draws scrutiny: boxing. For years, fight managers whisper about shadow promoters who control bouts, steer contenders, and skim earnings. Frank Carbo, a lethal figure from an earlier generation who became a hidden influence in the sport, operates alongside Frank Blinky Palermo. Both are closely associated with the Lucchese family in law enforcement files. Senate committees and federal prosecutors probe their activities as the decade closes. Cases in 1959 and the early 1960 seconds result in convictions for extortion and conspiracy tied to control over fighters and promoters. Again, Tommy does not sit at ringside giving orders. He shields himself behind layers of fixers. But the pattern is clear. Areas where money and leverage intersect: labor, trucking, sports, are areas where his reach is felt. The year 1957 tilts the balance of power across the city. Frank Costello, the smooth-talking broker of political connections and a longtime ally in cautious business, is wounded in an assassination attempt and retires. Albert Anastasia, a terrifying presence atop another major organization, is murdered months later in a barbershop attack. Carlo Gambino, long patient and methodical, steps into leadership. Through it all, Tommy maintains his practiced calm. He had long quietly cultivated Gambino, who shares his taste for order and profit without parades. Their partnership becomes one of the most important in the American underworld over the next decade. Together, they prefer consensus over warfare, using the commission to manage disputes and isolate hotheads who threaten the bottom line. That same year, a large meeting of leaders from around the country is called at a country home near Binghamton, New York, hosted by Joseph Barbara. The gathering at Appalachian aims to settle issues after months of upheaval. It turns into a fiasco when state troopers converge on the property and men sprint into fields and woods to avoid detention. Dozens are caught. Many more are photographed. The public sees in one afternoon what investigators had been describing for years. Tommy is not there. Accounts vary as to why. Some say he considered the idea foolish and refused to attend. Others suggest health or scheduling kept him away. Either way, his absence saves him from the mugshots and court battles that follow. In the eyes of peers, it confirms his reputation for caution. Even careful men face bad days. Law enforcement pressure increases after Appalachian. The FBI shifts its posture and begins systematic files on leaders and soldiers known or suspected to belong to the 5 New York families. The Bureau compiles organizational charts, wiretaps social clubs, and tracks visits to union halls and politicians' offices. New York's district attorneys, some hungry for higher office, announce drives against labor parasites in the garment district and beyond. Tommy is subpoenaed more than once in the late 950 seconds. He arrives, declines to answer specific questions by citing constitutional rights, and leaves without looking back at reporters. His refusal to spar verbally robs the press of quotes and keeps his personal image hazy. Narcotics become a point of contention within and between families by the end of the decade. Officially, leadership in New York warns against involvement, seeing drug cases as magnets for draconian sentences and relentless federal attention. In practice, some crews chase the profits anyway. Within the Lucchese ranks, John Little Guy Ormento emerges as an aggressive captain connected to heroin distribution networks that run from East Harlem to Midwestern hubs and into Los Angeles. Federal agents strike at that network in a series of cases around 1,959 and 1,960, and Ormento is eventually convicted and sent away. The public record does not place Tommy at the center of those deals. In fact, he is frequently described as opposing narcotics precisely because of the heat they bring. But the arrests show the limits of a boss's control in a huge city where ambitions multiply. He responds by installing steadier men in positions near susceptible earnings and by pressing his rule, earn without inviting a federal task force to breakfast. Idlewild Airport, later renamed JFK, grows into a gateway for cargo as jets shrink distances. With cargo come unions, contracts, and choke points that look familiar to someone who had long managed garment trucking. The Lucchese family begins to place trusted people in and around air freight locals and warehouse operations near the airport. Names associated with those zones, like Paul Vario in Brooklyn's Canarsie and East New York neighborhoods, build reputations for managing crews who understand how to take a sliver from a very large pie without collapsing the bakery. The techniques are muted. A contractor who never seems to lose a bid, a cargo handler whose overtime list always favors the same men, a quiet request that a pallet be left untouched for an hour. These are not blueprints. They are examples of the kind of persistent pressure that adds up over months and years. Tommy monitors the growth and insists that the airport remain a place where money is made discreetly, not a spotlight. His personal style never changes. He dresses cleanly but not loudly, prefers the same restaurants, tips staff who keep conversations private, and carries himself like a vice president at a wholesaler rather than a folk villain. He rarely uses telephones for anything sensitive. When he needs to deliver a strong message, he does it with a sentence that sounds like advice. He is not the sort of boss who slaps a table and shouts. He is the sort who looks at a watch and asks if a person truly wants extra trouble on top of the trouble he already has. That tone builds loyalty among men who see temper as a weakness. It also frustrates investigators who wait for a dramatic scene they can turn into a report. Business ties push beyond the garment blocks as the decade closes. Some of his people move into construction hauling, ready-mix concrete delivery, and debris removal at a time when the city is replacing old tenements with high-rise projects. The pattern repeats. Link with a union local. Position friendly faces in key offices. Accept steady payments for predictable work. And use the threat of delay as leverage rather than overt harm. Developers and contractors, squeezed by schedules and financing terms, often find it simpler to go along. A few resist and call prosecutors. Arrests happen, headlines bloom. Then the city returns to its normal rhythm, and those who learned the lesson keep their projects on time. Through all of this, he maintains a long friendship with Frank Costello, even after Costello steps away from leadership. The two men share a belief that influence comes from relationships, not gunfire. At the same time, Tommy deepens his alliance with Carlo Gambino. The result is a balancing act. He keeps lines open to the old political networks, while aligning with the rising power who wants calm and profit. On the commission, he supports moves that sideline disruptive figures and backs decisions that stabilize income streams. He is not trying to be the loudest voice. He is trying to be the one everyone knows they need when a dispute threatens to turn expensive. By the end of the 1,950 seconds, the outline of his legacy is visible. He has turned a mid-level crew into a disciplined, diversified organization that touches everything from dress sleeves to ring ropes to cargo bays. The methods are illegal, built on intimidation and the manipulation of union rules, but they are also carefully calibrated to avoid spectacle. He does not issue manifestos. He does not chase magazine covers. He builds. He waits. He corrects mistakes quickly and without public ceremony. He tells his men that the city pays best when the streets are boring and the clock runs true. He also knows the tide can turn. Federal agents are learning the streets. State commissions are getting bolder. Reporters are less afraid after Riesel's attack proves that silence doesn't buy safety. He adapts by simplifying command lines, reducing contact with middlemen who love rumors, and quietly investing in legitimate businesses that can carry weight when scrutiny intensifies. Restaurants, trucking companies with clean paperwork, small factories with real orders, these give cover and cushion. They also give family members lawful jobs and reasons to be seen entering an office that isn't a clubhouse. When the calendar flips to a new decade, the man at the center of this web is in full command. His hand, missing 2 fingers, rests lightly on table edges as he listens. A pen ticks on paper once or twice when a visitor talks too long. Then he stands, adjusts his tie, and steps back into a city that he understands at the level of elevators and freight doors, union ballots, and city permits. He has survived waves that drowned louder men. He is not done shaping the map. Picture a quiet corner booth near a window, where the city hums like a faraway radio. A small man in a neat suit lifts his cup, listens more than he talks, and notices everything: the courier who keeps glancing at the clock, the accountant who folds his napkin into exact squares, the foreman who arrives early but never orders eggs because he's too nervous to eat. Outside, trucks groan into gear, elevators open and close like lungs, and a thin ribbon of steam slips from sewer grates into morning air. He traces the routes in his head, from cutting room to sewing floor to loading dock to rail yard to store. He can tell who's holding up a shipment from the way a driver rubs his fingers together or a dispatcher pauses before answering a simple question. No speeches, no dramatics. Just a nod, a list, a plan. In a city that rewards the loud, he wins by being the person everyone counts on to keep the clock moving. By the start of the 1,960 seconds, Tommy Lucchese's influence feels like infrastructure. The garment lanes still carry his fingerprints: trucking schedules, union locals, insurance disputes that resolve when he leans on the right person. Illegal betting runs as predictably as a utility, with parlor phones ringing steady during racing hours, layers of collectors between the storefront and the counting room. Loan books thicken on the Bronx side, where a shop owner who needs cash before a season starts knows exactly which friendly clerk to call. None of it looks glamorous. That's the point. He cultivates a routine so unremarkable that it disappears into the rhythm of workday life. The federal government, newly determined after the Appalachian fiasco, doesn't miss the pattern. The FBI launches the Top Hoodlum program, assigns agents to every borough, and builds charts that guess at who sits where. Robert Kennedy pushes the Justice Department to chase racketeers through tax cases, labor statutes, and anything else that can stick. City prosecutors revive old garment probes, pull files on trucking co-ops, and look harder at how labor peace always seems to arrive in offices where men whisper about envelopes. Subpoenas follow. Hearings follow those subpoenas. Tommy's response remains the same: respectful, brief, careful. He appears when ordered, invokes rights when questions target operations, and leaves without giving reporters the quote they seek. Alliances at the top stabilize. Carlo Gambino moves into quiet control after 1957 and proves a natural partner: orderly, cautious, decisive, without noise. Together, they favor long-game thinking. They use the commission to tamp down feuds, steer opportunities to the factions that can manage them, and sideline figures who behave like arsonists in a warehouse full of fabric. Their cooperation reaches into construction hauling, wholesale markets, and certain unions that decide who gets what shift. Each man understands the other's prized rule: never invite attention that you don't need. Family life underscores that alliance. In 1962, Carlo Gambino's son Thomas marries Tommy's daughter Frances, a union that papers and investigators see as a public seal on a private partnership. The wedding itself draws curious glances from the press. Two old-world power bases tied by family vows. Law enforcement reads symbolism in every smile. To those around them, it means something simpler. Neither house wants turbulence. Both prefer steady earnings to daring grabs. The alliance will matter when storms arrive. Storms do arrive in the shape of Joseph Valachi. In 1963, the Genovese soldier, fearing for his life after prison rumors, place a target on his back. turns informant. He testifies in Washington about structures and titles, gives the country a vocabulary, Cosa Nostra, commission, capos, and soldiers, and confirms for the average viewer what detectives had been sketching for years. He names Tommy as head of one of the 5 New York families and places him in the circle that coordinates major policies. Nothing in Valachi's recitation gives prosecutors a new single charge to file that day, but it pulls secrecy's curtain aside. Tommy adjusts by trimming his visibility even more. Fewer public lunches, more controlled routes to meetings, fresh layers between himself and any point where cash changes hands. Criminal exposure in the 1,960 seconds takes shape through labor statutes and business regulations rather than dramatic scenes. State cases pound at trucking rings that set rates and blackball holdouts. Grand juries probe extortion masked as membership dues for associations that claim to protect deliveries. Federal prosecutors press antitrust angles where they can. The names on indictments are mostly lieutenants, union officials, and executives who signed the wrong paper. When a fixer pleads out, another takes his slot by the next calendar quarter. Tommy insists on that redundancy. If one spoke breaks, the wheel keeps turning. Sports remain a magnet too. The fallout from the boxing scandals of the late 1950 seconds trials that end with convictions for Frank Carbo and Blinky Palermo in 1961 lingers through the early 60 seconds. Those cases lay bare how shadow promoters cornered fighters and promoters, siphoned purses, and bullied television deals. Law enforcement files often place those men in proximity to the Lucchese sphere over prior years. Tommy's name stays in the background as a senior partner whose interests intersect with theirs, not as a man who fixed bouts personally. Even so, the glare from those trials helps convince him to keep his core business tied to workday necessities, where profits arrive in small, constant bites. At the same time, the airport grows into a second garment center. Idlewild's soon-to-be Kennedy becomes a 24-hour puzzle of pallets, forklifts, customs officers, and trucking schedules. Unions decide who works which shift. Freight companies decide which customers load first. Influence in those nodes produces leverage worth more than a single windfall. Trusted hands from Brooklyn and Queens move into nearby Teamsters locals and related jobs. Investigators will later map entire lines that run from airport docks to distribution centers across the region and place many of those paths under Lucchese protection. Tommy doesn't need his name on a lease when he can tilt a hiring list or nudge a contract. The method isn't new, only the geography changes. Not everyone in his orbit sticks to his low-heat doctrine. Narcotics tempt some men who like fast scores. John Ormento, a powerful captain under him, becomes a key figure in heroin conspiracies that cross borough lines and state borders. Federal agents work those cases hard. By 1959 and into the early 960 seconds, indictments land, and Ormento is sentenced. Tommy publicly discourages any contact with drug trafficking and punishes associates who test that boundary because he knows narcotics bring the kind of attention that can wreck an entire enterprise. In practice, he also knows a boss can't control every decision in a city this large. His answer is structural. Keep narcotics away from garment trucking, away from airport locals, away from the cleanest income streams. Assign calmer stewards to zones where ambitions run hot. Politics remain a subtle instrument. He stays close to community leaders who can grease permits, to party figures who can guide an inspection from punitive to routine. Middle-tier politicians, those who need volunteers, printing, vans on election day, are more accessible than big names, more grateful for help, and more likely to answer a phone when a friend calls with a request that keeps a business humming. Investigators try to trace those favors into corruption charges. Paper trails stay murky. Phone calls go unrecorded. As always, he is rarely the person who asks directly. At home, discipline looks like habit. A modest house on the South Shore, a regular driver, a schedule that repeats. He sends small gifts. A Christmas basket to a doorman whose building sees lots of visitors. A donation to a parish that hosts union. Meetings. A scholarship to a neighborhood kid who knows his uncle through a trucking depot. These gestures build a web of gratitude that has nothing to do with fear, but helps when fear would be clumsy. He believes everyone prefers stability. He sells stability. Inside the family, successors form a bench. Anthony Corallo stands out, thoughtful, tidy, fluent in unions and city contracts. a master at staying off the radar long enough to earn his nickname for ducking subpoenas. Paul Vario in Brooklyn runs a disciplined crew, turns neighborhood businesses into steady contributors, and understands that a quiet street can still produce a thick envelope. Carmine Tremonti, older and well-liked, carries weight across gambling and loans. Tommy uses all three and several others to spread risk and reward. He rotates responsibilities so that no one person controls a choke point long enough to feel untouchable. The press tries to fix a clear picture of his crimes as the decade unfolds, but the mosaic stays complex. Extortion in the garment trades remains central, built on control of trucking, warehouse guards, and labor peace. Illegal gambling operations keep pulling in cash from horse rooms, dice games, and card clubs, protected by layers of intermediaries. Loan sharking fills gaps that banks leave, especially for small factories and shops that need quick money. Bribery appears in the margins in an envelope for a building inspector who suddenly remembers a different priority, in a favor that softens a fine, in a quiet introduction that steers a contract. Conspiracy charges gather these strands when prosecutors can link enough pieces. Even then, juries often hesitate when victims won't testify or witnesses go vague. The absence of a dramatic photograph or a taped order helps him survive those pushes. Age sneaks up around 1,965. He feels it in a late-a-day fog that coffee can't lift, and in the need to sit more than he used to during long meetings. Doctors start using words like tumor and treatment. He cuts back on appearances and works through trusted deputies, still reading ledgers, still catching a phony number on a page with a glance. His damaged hand taps slower now, not with impatience, but with effort. Friends see the change. Rivals see an opening and find none, because he planned for decline the way he planned for everything else. Succession isn't a ceremony. It's a series of adjustments. He keeps Corallo close on union and trucking issues, uses Vario to keep Brooklyn steady, and leans on Tremonti to maintain peace in gambling and loans when his own strength dips. Outside forces shape the choice as well. Corallo faces legal trouble of his own that complicates immediate elevation. Tremonti, though older, offers a caretaker's patience and deep respect from peers. Those realities set the stage for what will happen after Tommy is gone. He isn't guessing. He builds a slope the organization can glide down rather than a cliff it will fall from. Through the last year of his life, he continues to nudge citywide decisions with Gambino. If a construction fight threatens to spill into open conflict, they cool it. If a labor matter risks embarrassing a friendly politician, they steer it to a settlement. The partnership that started in practicality has become the stabilizing axis in New York's underworld, a fact that agents grudgingly admire even as they try to break it. He dies on the 13th of July 1967 at his home in Lido Beach, from a brain tumor that finally overcomes him. The funeral draws relatives, quiet businessmen, union men who owe careers to his calls, and a field of plain sedans filled with agents taking plate numbers. There is no open display, no speeches, just a line of people who understood what he had been to them. Problem solver, protector, collector. Newspapers run obituaries that list his age, his origins in Palermo and East Harlem, the arc from bootlegging to boardroom-style racketeering, and the belief among investigators that he helped design a modern machine for extracting money from the city without constant bloodshed. After his death, Carmine Tremonti takes the chair as a caretaker, which suits the times. The government has learned lessons from the past decade. Surveillance grows more sophisticated. Juries less patient with, "I don't recall." Yet the outfit Tommy shaped does not collapse. Corallo will eventually take the helm and turn the family into a force that still speaks his language. Unions, trucking, construction, airports. Vario's Brooklyn crew keeps proving how much wealth hides in ordinary jobs. The airport lanes broaden into full-fledged pipeline control. Garment influence adapts to changing fashion cycles in suburban malls. The machine keeps moving because he built it to. What remains when you strip away gossip and myth is a ledger of crimes that touched everyday systems. Extortion in labor and trucking, illegal gambling, loans at crushing terms, bribery, and conspiracies that arranged all of the above. Layered across those were suspected orders for lethal discipline in earlier decades, though courts never pinned those acts to him by name. He preferred pressure that didn't echo, a delayed truck instead of a broken window, a lost contract instead of a headline. That approach allowed him to shape markets for 30 years, while flashier contemporaries burned out. The city barely noticed the hand that guided so much of its movement because he wanted it that way. Owners got deliveries, workers drew paychecks, politicians cut ribbons, and money leaked at the edges into a network he maintained with patience. He proved that a steady temperament could be as formidable as brute force, that attention is a tax you don't have to pay if you learn to avoid it, and that control over choke points, docks, trucks, union offices, airport bays can produce fortunes without a single banner announcing who's in charge. In that sense, his quiet legacy is visible every time a schedule matters more than a speech. Midday in Midtown has its own weather. Heat rises off truck hoods, cold air leaks from factory doors, and a breeze catches scraps of tissue paper cut from dress patterns. A man passes through this small storm like a commuter who's been walking the route for decades. He lets managers talk. He asks small questions that land like probes in soft soil. How many shipments missed last week? Which shop switched to a new carrier? Which steward suddenly bought a nicer suit? He never needs to say what everyone in the room already understands. If deadlines slip, someone is going to pay. Better to keep the calendar true. The crews steady. The checks arriving. The city quiet. Long before the world learned the words that Valachi would make famous, he had built a system that turned choke points into levers. The garment district wasn't just a place. It was a sequence fabric in cutting, sewing, pressing, boxing, loading, and out. The moment you influenced one step, you could influence the whole chain. He didn't invent that truth. He turned it into daily practice. Trucking co-ops that looked like friendly neighborhood associations happened to share a small clubhouse with a man who owed him favors. A warehouse guard service with a patriotic name happened to hire only stewards from locals aligned with his friends. A negotiating committee chosen by a union's bylaws happened to include a fellow whose brother ran a small cafe where a back table was always reserved for certain lunches. None of this appeared on paper the way a prosecutor would want. All of it added up to money. A younger version of him learned the craft in East Harlem and the Bronx, where policy betting and bootlegging taught him the two laws he never broke. Never let anger dictate price, and never let a crowd set your schedule. He advanced by offering solutions. A shopkeeper facing a strike could be presented with two futures: a week of headlines and losses, or a quiet conversation and a return to normal. He would ask what the owner preferred, and allow the minutes to answer. That tone, calm, almost courteous, distinguished him from men who treated every negotiation like a threat. He favored the gentle line that turned a partner into a recurring payment rather than a one-time conquest that spawned enemies. In the 1,930 seconds, he watched old names fall while newer men tried new arrangements. The end of the Castellammarese struggle left scars on streets and in ledgers. A quiet Bronx figure, Gaetano Gagliano, emerged to guide what had been the Reina crew, and the man with the missing fingers became his indispensable deputy. The partnership suited both. Gagliano valued order more than theater. Tommy delivered order at scale. If an extortion scheme in one corner got sloppy and drew a detective's eye, he would dismantle it before the next shift and replace it with something duller that brought in the same revenue. The lesson repeated until it became culture. The machine survives because it changes shape faster than a subpoena can be typed. He understood the tension between union ideals and shop floor realities. The garment industry had a long history of workers fighting for safer conditions and fair pay. He didn't try to crush that history. He redirected it. The phrase labor peace became a product that could be purchased, and people bought it because chaos cost more. When a merchant or factory owner decided to resist, his resistance rarely failed because of a single terrifying moment. It failed under the weight of daily inconveniences that bled profit. A shipment that didn't move on time, a miscount that produced scrap, an overtime list that left skilled hands idle, a rumor that a key wholesaler had doubts and was shifting orders. He presented those inconveniences as coincidences until the moment the buyer accepted a service agreement masked as a handshake. He kept a foot in the city's other cash streams without letting them knock the garment machine off balance. Gambling produced steady intake when it was layered properly. A runner delivered envelopes to an address that changed every few months. An apartment with a rotary phone became a betting room for a season, then turned back into a quiet place where a widow watched television. If police appeared, they found a level of the network designed to absorb the blow. The core kept working. Loan books hummed with repayments from shop owners, bartenders, and small contractors who preferred fast cash to bank interviews. The rates were stiff. The collections were predictable. In neighborhoods that lived on schedules, predictability carried its own kind of approval. He cultivated labor intermediaries who flourished in gray zones. Johnny Dio Gardi. Johnny Dio became notorious for creating paper locals and flipping them into bargaining chips. Public attention eventually turned Dio into a headline magnet, especially after the attack that left columnist Victor Riesel blind. The state went after Dio on multiple fronts and won convictions. Throughout, observers placed Dio and other labor fixers inside Tommy's sphere. Responsible accounts stopped short of claims that Tommy personally ordered such outrages. His method favored pressure that left no lasting spectacle. What mattered to him was that the association dues kept flowing, the co-ops stayed in line, and friendly union officers could deliver votes when schedules depended on it. He learned early to treat politicians like another union local. Neither enemy nor savior, just another partner with needs. Ward leaders wanted turnout and trucks on election day. Borough operatives needed meeting halls and a set of calm streets when a candidate came to shake hands. Favors moved in both directions. A permit expired and was renewed without fuss. A fine was recalculated. A rumor died. If anyone asked, it was all constituent service and administrative discretion. He never appeared as the man behind the favor. He preferred to be the person whose name didn't enter the minutes of the meeting. His circle widened as air freight matured into a second landscape of leverage. Idlewild's warehouses and customs offices offered the same mechanics he had mastered on 7th Avenue. Control hiring lists, influence overtime, steer contracts, and the money follows. Paul Vario's people understood how to make that world pay without setting off alarms. A cargo pallet that sat for an hour could become incentive. A bid that never seemed to lose suggested a handshake somewhere. Investigators noticed and sketched charts that linked teams, locals, and companies. Those charts rarely led back to a signature with his name. They led to patterns. He had built a life out of patterns. Inside his family, he turned men into managers. Anthony Corallo took to the garment schedules the way a watchmaker takes to tiny gears. Corallo's talent for avoiding subpoenas ducks was more than luck. It was the result of an operating system that kept bosses away from the heat and the heat away from the bosses. Paul Vario ran Brooklyn's piece like a neighborhood utility, making sure every small venture fed the larger account. Carmine Tremonti, older, careful, carrying years of respect, steadied lines that might have frayed in lesser hands. That bench strength wasn't an accident. He built it the way he built everything else, one measured decision at a time. He could not keep every man from making choices he disliked. Narcotics put gleam in reckless eyes. He saw only risk. Long sentences, aggressive federal task forces, informants. John Armento's fall on heroin charges confirmed his fear. The response was structural. Keep drug money on a separate island, nowhere near garment trucking or the airport, and remove any captain who couldn't resist quick profit. He didn't preach morals. He ran a risk ledger. The boxing world's troubles orbited his sphere without landing on his desk. Frank Carbo and Blinky Palermo made the sport resemble a private market in outcomes and contracts. Senate hearings pulled their names into national conversation and led to convictions in 1961. Their history crossed paths with men in his orbit, because the same skills that sway trucking routes can sway undercards and television slots. He didn't need to order fixes to benefit from an arrangement in which friends prospered. The glare from those cases simply reinforced a preference he already held. Stay anchored in industries the city needs every day, and the public never stops to admire. As pressure from law enforcement grew in the 1,960 seconds, his discipline hardened. The FBI's top hoodlum program turned speculation into candor inside case files. Wiretaps sprouted. Social clubs acquired microphones along with coffee pots. He changed venues, shortened meetings, and cut middlemen who liked to gossip. When he had to appear, he treated every deist the same way. Arrive on time, answer nothing beyond name and address, rely on counsel, and let the Constitution carry the rest. Judges and juries may have wanted a confession. He gave them procedure. The alliance with Carlo Gambino became the spine of citywide decision-making. Where others saw rivalry, they built equilibrium. A dispute over construction hauling could spin into arrests and newspaper stories, or it could be arranged into territories and schedules that let both sides bill. They always chose the latter. The families needed that kind of balance to keep revenue secure. Their partnership didn't eliminate disputes, it priced them. There were moments when his touch could be seen even by people who didn't know his name. A strike rumored for Monday vanished on Friday night after a long discussion. A merchant who swore he would never pay a fee for protection discovered that a few deliveries handled by a friendly service arrived faster and with less loss. A politician facing a noisy demonstration saw it relocated to a smaller plaza where cameras wouldn't fill the frame. The city kept its appointments. He kept his numbers. The myth that followed him suggested he was gentle because he smiled and preferred words to spectacles. That myth helped him. He wanted people to underestimate his steel. Discipline existed. It simply operated off stage. The underworld isn't a polite book club. People who stole or endangered the machine paid. Writers and cops lined up names with sudden ends and penciled him into the margins as a likely author of policy. Direct proof proved scarce. Silence did its work. In the end, history remembered him for the stability he engineered as much as for suspected episodes that the courts never laid at his feet. Old age does not ask permission before it enters a room. He felt it in the mid-1960 seconds, and his circle felt it with him. He had prepared the handoff long before doctors delivered their news. He thinned his schedule to the hours when his mind was sharpest. He focused on what mattered. Union ties that needed tending, contracts that required a nudge, alliances that demanded a quiet lunch and a predictable dessert. He would still tap his scarred hand on tables when unaudited numbers looked wrong. He still held in his head the map of streets where a phone call in the morning could change a loading dock by afternoon. He left the world in 1967 with a record that even rivals acknowledged. A builder of influence who saw modern cities as opportunities for leverage. He did not set out to become a folk figure. He set out to turn deadlines and delivery routes into revenue. The criminal code is clear about what that meant. Extortion, coercion, illegal gambling, loans at rates designed to trap borrowers, bribery, conspiracy. He rarely used a word more dramatic than arrangement to describe it, but the harm landed on union members whose votes were steered, on owners who paid so the clock would run, and on consumers whose prices included quiet taxes for peace. After he was gone, the machine he designed kept moving, because design outlives designers. Carmine Tramonti held the chair for a period that required patience and discretion. Anthony Corallo later became the steward whose own long tenure mirrored his style. Low profile, labor-savvy, relentless about routine, Paul Vario's zone would someday brush the edges of stories that made headlines, proof that legacies wander. Those chapters belong to other men in later years. What mattered for his story is that he left a framework that could be taught. Compress risk, spread exposure, maintain alliances, keep the cash close and the noise far away. Look closely, and you see his thumbprint in places where people thought only economic forces operated. A garment owner who switched carriers because rates were better might also have enjoyed a sudden drop in missing inventory. A trucking firm that joined a certain association found its tires mysteriously avoided nails near a particular loading dock. A union steward who won a small internal election didn't realize that his victory had been arranged 3 conversations earlier so a contract deadline wouldn't blow up. These weren't miracles. They were the outputs of a system designed to make cause and effect look like coincidence. He understood image as a tool. The trimmed mustache, the tailored but understated suits, the habit of letting others talk first. These were choices. He returned favors with small human touches. Flowers promptly sent when a child was born, a call to a doctor who made room in a schedule, a repairman who arrived early for an elderly neighbor. Those gestures weren't charity in the sentimental sense. They were investments that yielded trust and silence. People like to help those who help them. When the person at the center asks for little in return, only that a meeting be set, a vote be counted, a contract be remembered, cooperation becomes habit, not burden. The facts of his life survive in court records, investigative files, and newspaper clippings that mention him obliquely while naming others directly. That, too, was by design. He kept his name off leases and payrolls, off minutes and memos, away from speeches and photographs. When his name did appear, it often came paired with a phrase that tells an entire story: decline to answer. He was not an orator. He was a manager of frictions in a city full of them. If you trace the path from Palermo to East Harlem, from a machine shop accident to a seat at the commission's table, from a short prison term to decades of quiet command, the through line is simple. He turned patience into power. The crimes were real and recurring. The harm spread in ways that were easy to overlook because the city kept moving. That was his gift and his legacy. People remember the explosions. He preferred the undramatic pressure that moves walls without anyone ever seeing the lever. Rain dots the sidewalk like Morse code, and taxis hiss past with wipers beating time. He waits out of the weather, not because he fears getting wet, but because he prefers to arrive when a room has settled. When he steps in, he notices the placement of chairs, and which ledger lies open, the ashtray a little too full. The way a receptionist's smile looks tight, like someone who heard a rumor at breakfast. He doesn't say much. He doesn't need to. He asks a practical question: how many trucks cleared the docks before noon yesterday, and lets the numbers tell him where the pressure belongs. In a city built on timetables, the person who reads delays the way others read headlines ends up holding levers few people ever see. The 1,960 seconds make those levers more valuable and more dangerous. New laws and better-trained investigators creep into places that once felt safe. Still, the structure he built holds because it rests on ordinary routines. The garment lanes keep producing. A dress that starts as fabric rolls on a cutting table, ends up on a rack in a department store 3 states away. And at each step, someone he trusts can nudge the pace. Illegal betting stays quiet in storefronts that look like regular candy shops and luncheonettes. If police push into one of those rooms, they find a slice of the operation designed to take heat while the deeper layers continue. Loan money circulates to bar owners, taverns, and small factories that always need a cushion to bridge seasons. He avoids greed for greed's sake. He wants as many steady streams as possible, none loud enough to draw a camera crew. Politics around him get rougher. One of the biggest storms in those years doesn't begin with a union vote or a trucking contract. It starts with a plot. Joseph Bonanno, head of another powerful New York organization, decides the future belongs to him and a very small circle, loyal only to his house. Investigators and later histories agree on the outlines. Bonanno considered eliminating 2 men he saw as obstacles: Carlo Gambino and Tommy. It was a move aimed at the heart of the balance that kept the city's underworld from tearing itself apart. The plan never happens. Pressure mounts. Federal agents and rival leaders push back. In 1964, Bonanno disappears for a time, and a messy internal conflict, the so-called Banana War, breaks out between his loyalists and men the commission recognizes. Through it all, Tommy doesn't bluster in public. He tightens his circles, varies routes, shortens meetings, and keeps his people focused on revenue rather than revenge. The lesson is clear enough to anyone paying attention. The bid to remove him fails because he never gives enemies a simple target. Daily management in those years looks like 100 boring chores that add up to power. He adjusts schedules in the garment district so late trucks don't stack up and become a headline. He makes sure a union steward who drinks too much is eased out before he creates a scandal. He asks a bookmaking crew why the odds board in a back room has drifted from market lines, and reminds them that stability beats a quick score that will bring complaints and raids. He disperses earnings so no one corner can crumble if a single arrest throws a week off. He has spent a lifetime turning crises into calendars. The government's understanding of his world grows more granular. After Appalachian, state and federal agencies treat the subject like infrastructure too. Charts, informants, wiretaps, audits. Joseph Valachi's testimony in 1963 puts names into living rooms and confirms for the public the structure detectives already suspected. He is identified in sworn testimony as the head of one of the 5 New York families and a voice on the commission that settles disputes. It doesn't give prosecutors a new single crime to file with his name on it, but it strips away a layer of mystery. His response is to become even more careful. He travels less and sends surrogates more. He insists that anyone who meets him arrive with clear, short agendas. He avoids places where a boom microphone might be waiting. Meanwhile, the partnership with Carlo Gambino hardens into the axis around which the city's underworld turns. They prize the same things: low noise, high reliability, negotiated settlements. When construction hauling in one borough threatens to become a turf brawl, they set quotas and lanes so both sides can invoice without fists. When a produce market needs order to keep food moving, they ensure hiring lists favor faces who return calls and shun theatrics. When a politician frets about scandal in a union stronghold just before an election, they prefer a quiet compromise that keeps crowds off the evening news. Both men understand how much money an ordinary week can create if no one lights a match. Union work remains the spine of Tommy's influence. He doesn't pretend the garment industry is a simple play. It's a maze of locals, work rules, and seasonal panics. He knows which union officers can count votes and which ones can't count their own change. He cultivates the steady hands, relies on intermediaries to draft agreements that look like ordinary labor peace, but function as revenue engines, and quietly drops any go-between who falls in love with headlines. He helps direct trucking associations that dress up extortion as dues and insurance. If a factory owner plays brave and resists, the consequences arrive as coincidences. A shipment that sits a few extra hours in a loading bay. A helper who calls in sick on the exact morning a big order is due. A client who hears a rumor about quality and places a smaller order next time. Eventually, the owner schedules a lunch to ask for help avoiding bad luck. The lunch ends with a timetable and a payment plan. He surrounds himself with managers who can work a room without turning it into theater. Anthony Corallo keeps the garment gears oiled, becoming essential precisely because he's so hard to pin down in court. Paul Vario extends the family's touch through Brooklyn's warehouse belts, understanding that a contract steered quietly can be worth more than a flashy score. Carmine Tremonti minds gambling and loans with a soft voice and a hard memory for who owes what. Others tend smaller plots, jukebox routes, vending machines, a share of restaurant suppliers, pieces of market stalls. He encourages multiplicity. If one crop fails, 5 others mature. The question of narcotics keeps testing that discipline. He remains skeptical, and by most credible accounts, opposed to dealing in heroin or similar trades. The logic is simple. Drug cases draw long sentences and relentless federal attention. Some leaders and soldiers ignore that rule. John Ormento's conviction on heroin charges earlier in the decade is proof of the danger. Tommy responds by isolating anyone suspected of using family channels to connect with drug networks, pushing that risk as far from his core revenues as possible. He isn't naive. He knows some men will chase speed over safety. He tries to limit the blast radius so garment trucking, airport freight, and construction remain insulated. Air freight in Queens becomes the second campus for his methods. The airport's non-stop schedule creates choke points similar to midtowns. Unions decide who gets which shift. Freight companies decide who unloads first. Security decides what gets a glance and what gets a second look. Influence in those small decisions transforms into money. Investigators later map a tangle of relationships among trucking firms, locals, and cargo handlers near the terminals, and see the pattern they've seen before in the garment district: quiet control over the pieces that make the clock run. He insists that the airport remain low drama. A single spectacular theft could bring a flood of badges and bad press. 1,000 minor preferences add up to the same profit without the sirens. His interactions with public officials stay calculated and modest. He doesn't chase senators or mayors. He keeps the company of district leaders, borough aides, and committee chairs, the people who decide if a permit gets processed this week or next month. He skips photo opportunities. He funds small projects and favors that yield real gratitude. A donation to a parish that hosts union meetings, a scholarship for a clerk's kid, a holiday basket delivered precisely on time to a firehouse that watches a block where one of his warehouses sits. When pressure comes, it arrives through a neighbor who says please, not a stranger who says or else. Reporters who follow his name through court calendars and affidavits often find the same pattern. When his world touches violence, and it does, because control sometimes demands endings, he is rarely in the room. Early-era killings tied to power struggles left a trail of suspicion around him. especially in the 1930 period when the death of Joseph Pinzolo helped reconfigure leadership in the old Reina circle. Cops and chroniclers long suspected that Tommy knew more than he ever admitted about who carried the pistols and why. They could not make a case a jury would trust. He maintains the boundary that protects men like him: distance, discipline, and layers of people between thought and act. The justice system, built to chase direct orders and direct evidence, struggles when confronted with a manager who runs on suggestions and outcomes. The public sometimes mistakes his calm for softness. The men who work for him do not. He demotes quietly when performance dips, cuts off access to profitable routes for anyone who grows careless, and, according to numerous investigators, approves harsher measures when theft or betrayal threatens the whole. He just refuses to make a show of it. That refusal helps him outlast rivals who turn punishment into parades and draw exactly the wrong kind of attention. He manages the optics of his own life with the same care. A modest home on Long Island. The same restaurants, the same waiter, the same corner tables. No flamboyant car collection. No gaudy displays. He escorts family to church on Sundays, visits friends at hospitals, sends flowers without notes. He gathers loyalty by making himself useful in ways that feel personal. A phone call that gets a relative into a job at a trucking firm, an introduction to a doctor, a quiet recommendation that resolves a licensing delay. He knows people will walk a long distance for someone who made their life simpler once. One undertold chapter from his last years is how he prepares others to solve problems after he's gone. He encourages Corallo to think in systems and to build shields against legal heat. He tells Vario to groom men who can manage a warehouse, a way station, and a union hall without calling for help every week. He urges Tramunti to keep gambling figures honest and to avoid the temptation to chase numbers that look good on sheets but stand out to auditors. He isn't writing a manual, he's reinforcing habits. The family will need those habits in the new climate of surveillance, grand juries, and televised hearings. Health narrows his circle as the decade moves on. The symptoms that doctors describe with clinical phrases become daily limits. Shorter meetings, longer pauses, fewer in-person appearances. He refuses to let weakness become spectacle. On days when the fog lifts, he still reads ledgers and notices a line that looks wrong. He still reminds a lieutenant that a friendly inspector prefers Thursday calls to Monday ones. He still calls a union contact to congratulate him on an internal victory that he quietly helped arrange. He keeps control by staying relevant, even as he delegates. By the mid-1960s, Bonanno's failed move against him and Gambino has become cautionary lore for anyone tempted to treat the commission as a suggestion box. The equilibrium Tommy nurtures profit over drama, process over pride reasserts itself. Other conflicts erupt elsewhere in the city. He helps tamp them down, reminding peers that every feud burns money neither side can replace easily in a climate where prosecutors are hunting for tests of their new tools. His lowy temperature doctrine isn't just preference anymore, it's survival strategy. When he dies in 1967, he leaves more than a name on a family. He leaves a layout. Unions where allies count votes, associations that shape contracts, trucking routes that feed dependable cash, airport lanes that move cargo on the schedules he prefers, and a bench of managers who know how to keep that system alive without a loud boss at the table. The crimes embedded in that layout: extortion masked as labor peace, rigged trucking, bribery, illegal gambling, predatory loans, conspiracies that pulled it all together do real damage, from the price tags on dresses to the integrity of union ballots. He never pretends otherwise in private. He just refuses to state it out loud. The city hums because people like him keep it humming for a fee. Years later, when younger detectives look back through case files and clippings, they marvel at how few direct quotes they can find from him. No comment. I decline to answer. On the advice of counsel. Those are the lines that end the transcripts. His silence was not a quirk, it was policy. He believed that the only story worth telling about himself was told in the way trucks lined up at loading docks, and the way a phone stopped ringing when he nodded to the right person. He understood all along that power in a place like New York lives in the small hinges, the overtime list, the permit renewal, the order in which shipments load on a Thursday afternoon when a storm is coming. He took those hinges, installed them where his people could reach them, and charged rent on the door. Others sought bigger moments. He built a life out of small ones. That is why a plot to erase him collapsed, why legal pushes missed more often than they hit, and why for decades, a modest man who rarely raised his voice shaped the daily motion of a city that preferred to believe it was moving on its own. Night settles over the South Shore with a soft whir of fridges humming, distant horns on the parkway, the ocean breathing against the sand. A desk lamp throws a small circle of light across a quiet room. He keeps index cards instead of long letters, each one a nudge to a person who can make something work. A clerk at a licensing office who likes his coffee sweet, a dispatcher whose son needs a job after graduation, a steward whose crew goes home happy if overtime rotates fairly. He moves the cards around like tiles, making sure no one person becomes irreplaceable. If a card goes missing, another slides into its place. He built power that way through parts that could be swapped without the machine stopping. The city that made him is still a grid of deadlines. Up on 7th Avenue, the clothing trade runs on clocks and lists. Trucks must appear. Elevators must be free. Bundles must leave when promised. Years earlier, he turned those simple rules into a steady income by gently guiding who got what and when. A shop owner would tell himself he was paying for reliability. He was in truth paying rent on a set of favors held in the right hands. The arrangement fit the times. Owners wanted quiet. Workers wanted hours. Disruption cost more than a few envelopes slipped across tables. He reduced an unruly market into a schedule that never quite ran on its own. Legends often claim a single masterstroke. His record is the opposite. 1,000 small edges. A cooperative of carriers that looks civic, minded, but shares dispatch notes with a trusted go-between. A security service that hires from friendly union lists, ensuring that doors open for the right people and close for the wrong ones. An industry committee that votes exactly the way 3 conversations decided it would. None of those pieces on their own screams crime. Together they bend a market. Prosecutors described it as coercion and extortion. He called it keeping the city moving. He preferred the label that worked best with a handshake. He never truly left the other streams that fed crews in the Bronx and in Brooklyn's quieter neighborhoods. Wagers on races and games traveled through small storefronts and backrooms with phones that rang on rhythm. A buyer placed a bet with a clerk who knew nothing about the layer above him, and that clerk passed totals to a man who only knew one number to dial. If police pushed in a door, they met a level built to take a hit. The core stayed out of reach, not because it hid in caves, but because it blended into ordinary apartments and quiet offices where a stack of ledgers could mean anything. Collections on loans moved the same way. You didn't need muscle in every doorway when callers preferred to keep business relations friendly and schedules consistent. One arena forced him to calibrate public attention with unusual care. Organized labor. He worked through intermediaries to shape votes, steer contracts, and frame disputes as misunderstandings that could be smoothed by friends of the industry. It wasn't charity. It was leverage disguised as help. Among those intermediaries, Johnny Diogardi stood out as a man who could conjure a union local from thin air and deliver it to a bargaining table with a smile. When columnist Victor Riesel was attacked in 1956, public anger reset the temperature. Investigations grew teeth. Dio ended up in court more than once, convicted on corruption and perjury charges tied to labor racketeering. Through it all, police and reporters kept pointing past Dio toward the quiet figure, whose name rarely appeared on any letterhead. Proof remained elusive. The structure existed because it left few fingerprints and many favors. Sports was another corridor where leverage could be traded. Fighters and promoters whispered about shadow figures who lined up bouts, nudged rankings, and skimmed purses. Frank Carbo and Blinky Palermo became the public faces of that world when Senate hearings and federal trials bore down on them by the end of the 1,950 seconds and into 1,961. Files linked their circles to associates within his sphere because the same traits control of venues, influence over contracts, comfort with pressure translated from one marketplace to another. He did not sit ringside issuing instructions on outcomes. He didn't have to. If friends could arrange the undercard and the television slot, revenue found its way through the same channels he'd been using for years, layered, polite, and difficult to trace. A different category of threat rose from inside his own universe. Some men chased speed, quick scores, flashier cuts of illegal profit, especially from narcotics. He wanted no part of that. Drugs drew federal attention that ate through the buffers he spent decades building. He warned, he punished, and he pushed anyone suspected of chasing heroin money far from his core lanes. John Ormento's conviction confirmed every fear he had about that trade. It also reminded him that a boss cannot throttle every impulse across a city this size. His answer, in every corner he controlled, was the same. Keep high-height ventures away from the arteries that matter: apparel transport, cargo on the tarmac, contracts at construction sites, and let the federal glare fall somewhere else. The airport in Queens provided a second laboratory for his tidy methods. Idlewild's warehouses buzzed day and night. By the time the place took the Kennedy name, it had grown into a small city with its own tempos. Decisions that looked trivial from outside: who unloads first, who works which shift, which trucking firm gets a gate pass translated into money when guided with intent. Men from Brooklyn and Queens who already knew his system took jobs in and around the cargo zones, some in unions, some in dispatch, others in private services that guarded storage bays. Investigators drew charts and kept drawing them. They found overlap with other families, because big ports never belonged to a single flag. What they always found in his lanes was the same signature: no splashy thefts, no show-offs, just steady preference for friends and steady discomfort for holdouts, until they became friends too. Politics intersected with every hallway he traveled. His appetite for headlines was nil. His appetite for practical help was boundless. Rather than chase handshakes with governors, he focused on the tier directly below the frame of the photograph. District leaders, borough secretaries, committee chairs, people who could speed a file rather than deliver a speech, populated his phone book. He returned their calls. He offered quiet assistance when a fundraiser needed chairs and a microphone, or when a precinct captain needed a platoon of volunteers on a rainy night. When he needed something simple, a permit calmed, a fine reaffigured, an inspector reminded that discretion exists, those same people returned the favor. The arrangement was less cloak and dagger than civic habit bent a few degrees off-center. He knew the risks. After the fiasco upstate in 1957, every major figure in his world had to accept that the ring of secrecy had thinned. The FBI's top hoodlum program made a slogan out of what had been a handful of case files and turned it into an index. Robert Kennedy pushed federal prosecutors to harvest cases from labor statutes and tax codes, and state commissions learned to use consent decrees as wedges. Then came Joseph Valachi, who in 1963 told a live audience the basic structure insiders had treated as a given for decades. Families, a board that settled disputes, titles that meant something beyond gossip. Valachi named him as the head of one of the 5 principal New York groups and placed him at the policy table. The effect was cultural more than legal. Grand juries didn't suddenly receive a tape of him ordering a crime, but the country filled in the blanks around a name that, until then, had been a whisper followed by no comment. Inside those last years, the biggest external challenge wasn't a subpoena, it was a rival's ambition. Joseph Bonanno, a proud and subtle man, saw a future in which fewer voices decided more. Accounts from law enforcement, and from later memoirs, some sworn, some disputed, agree on one grave claim. Bonanno considered removing both Carlo Gambino and the small, tidy organizer from the South Shore to seize the balance. The push unraveled in 1964. Bonanno vanished for a time. His organization split into factions, one loyal to his son, one aligned with the broader council. What could have been a crisis for the whole framework turned into a lesson that confirmed the wisdom of his alliance with Gambino. Stability survived because 2 men who valued it more than pride had built pathways around pride. He did not pretend to be more virtuous than he was. He knew exactly what the law called the arrangements he relied on. Extortion dressed as dues, coercion framed as labor relations, bribes filed under donations, illegal odds books wrapped in the cozy decor of a candy counter. The city, in turn, paid a hidden tax, higher prices for goods, unions less free than they looked, competitors who discovered the market didn't really welcome competition. If anyone around him drifted into self-happity about the burdens of leadership, he cut the talk short. He wanted efficiency, not poetry. Privacy was both shield and instrument. He kept a small footprint. Clean suits, modest car, favorite restaurants with staff, who knew when to step away. He lived in a tidy house, not a palace. He called on friends when they were ill and sent flowers that arrived without fanfare. He spread favors around in ways that didn't scream allegiance. A scholarship here, a doctor's appointment there, a nephew steered toward a job that opened doors. People who received those gestures didn't feel bought. They felt remembered. And people who feel remembered repay, often without needing to be asked. A habit that set him apart was his tolerance for boredom. He didn't chase deals that glittered. He asked his people to build breadth. A dozen small franchises inside restaurants for cigarette machines and jukeboxes. Contracts to haul debris for a municipal project. No reporter would visit twice. Maintenance agreements at storage facilities that looked like boxes piled upon boxes. A slice of a supplier that nobody outside a union hall wanted to talk about. Each stream was dull by design, one notch below newsworthiness. Add them all up, and the ledger became a steady tide. Agents peering through a window wanted a single picture they could blow up and frame with a headline. He gave them a collage of errands. When discipline had to be enforced, he avoided theater. He demoted men by removing income, not by staging scenes. He rotated assignments so that a favorite who grew careless felt gravity and corrected. If theft or betrayal rose to the level that insiders would later call an answer, suspicions formed in the city's rumor mills about where the nod had come from. Courts needed more than rumors. He ensured that courts rarely got it. That gap between belief and proof left a long list of acts that chroniclers label suspected or alleged. He refused to fill in the missing words. Those who worked close to him remember small rituals. He showed up on time. He disliked being kept waiting, and disliked keeping others waiting even more. He read page after page of numbers without losing patience, looking for a figure that didn't fit. He preferred instructions that sounded like questions. He expected his men to treat waiters with respect, and to tip cab drivers correctly. These weren't quirks. They were extensions of a worldview in which chaos signaled weakness and courtesy signaled control. He never forgot how it felt to be the kid from Palermo turned East Harlem errand runner whose value lay in being reliable. By his final season on the board, he had become the quiet constant in rooms where others came and went. The list of documented crimes that trailed him looked less like a rap sheet and more like an economic map. Labor racketeering in the clothing, trades that siphon money from every dress and coat. Coerced membership in carrier associations that set rates by whisper rather than market. Bribes skimmed from contracts and placed as grease in bureaucratic gears. Illegal wagering arranged to look like phones and ledgers in forgettable rooms. Loans structured to keep borrowers on a leash. Conspiracies that turned all those threads into fabric that few outside his world ever saw. On top of those, a trail of suspected authorizations for lethal solutions in earlier decades, always one step beyond courtroom certainty. He drew a line of his own. No grandstanding, no speeches, no photographs by choice. When summoned, he appeared, gave his name, and declined to answer other questions. He was content to let lawyers speak in a vocabulary designed to build silence. The public learned to read between the lines the way he always had. A man who says nothing that many times is saying something about how he believes power survives. The final irony of his life is that the city loved what he sold, even as it condemned the way he sold it. People wanted predictability. He made a business out of delivering it. In return, he took a toll that most budgets absorbed, and that few headlines could capture without sounding technical. Ask an owner in the clothing blocks what changed after an agreement, and you would hear about trucks that suddenly hit their windows and about a dispiriting math problem that vanished. Ask a union member, and you'd hear about hours and overtime lists that made sense most days, and then, if you listened longer, you'd hear about votes that never seemed to surprise insiders. He massaged the friction points until checks cleared and callers calmed. And then he sent collectors to gather the thank you. To understand him, you don't need a photograph from a courthouse step. You need a weekday morning timetable for freight elevators, a stacking order for pallets at a cargo bay, a sequence of phone calls exchanged before lunch between men who never write memos. That is where his signature lives, in the unremarkable places where cause and effect can pass for coincidence, and where an entire metropolis can be tilted a few degrees by someone who knows which small hinges to touch and when to take his hand away. A winter morning turns the city silver. Frost rims loading dock rails, drivers blow into their hands, and steam coils from manholes like soft flags. He steps out of a car that looks like any other and walks the curb as if counting paces. The men he meets think they know what the conversation will be about rates, delays, overtime, but he's there for something smaller. He wants to know why a particular elevator seems to stall at the 3rd floor after lunch, why a dispatcher started favoring a new route down 11th Avenue, why a foreman's absence on Wednesdays keeps showing up in shipping logs. To outsiders, these are trivia. To him, they are early warnings that the machine he built could rattle if he doesn't tighten a screw before anyone hears it. His way of doing things grew from older habits that survived every crackdown. In the early years, he realized that money hides in places no one wants to argue about: elevators, docks, lunch breaks, payroll lists. He found allies who could move those levers without a scene. A civic association in the trucking trade sounded benign to anyone reading a brochure. Inside, it coordinated dispatch, set rates by phone call, and punished strays with delays that felt accidental. A security firm bragged about protecting warehouses. It also decided which doors opened quickly, a power that made skeptical owners cooperative after a few bad weeks. A committee inside a union debated contracts on the record. Off the record, votes landed exactly where a handful of calls aimed them. None of this looked illegal in a single snapshot. In sequence, it formed a chokehold, and he treated that chokehold like an asset to be cared for, not flaunted. He divided attention between those workaday engines and other streams that paid as long as nobody shouted. Wagers on horses and ball games passed through lunch counters and barbershops where chalkboards served as decor and phones rang on a rhythm only regulars noticed. A shill never learned the collector's full name. The collector never met the layer above him. The man counting on a quiet 2nd floor listened to totals without touching a bet. When a storefront got raided, the blast hit a cushion and the core kept going. Small loans crossed evening tables, ready cash for a restaurateur who needed to cover a vendor, for a shop that misjudged a season, for a contractor waiting on a slow client. The terms were steep, the schedules strict, the collections polite until they weren't. This was not cinema. It was cash flow, arranged to look like routine. The garment trades remained his signature, not because dresses and coats thrilled him, but because schedules do. A bolt of wool becomes a jacket only if cutters, stitchers, pressers, and truckers hit their marks. He made a product out of that reality, predictability for a price. Owners learned that bad luck could fall away after lunch with the right intermediary. Work rules that had hardened into grievances melted into compromises when someone he trusted took a seat on a committee. Trucks found green lights. Elevators stopped sticking. Insurance claims stopped languishing. The money that underwrote this calm moved quietly, skimmed from dues, padded onto invoices, or dropped in envelopes labeled with bland abbreviations. Investigators called it extortion and conspiracy. He described it, when he described it at all, as keeping the city on time. Unions became the arena where his finesse met its fiercest tests. Many locals in the garment center carried proud histories of strikes that won real gains. He didn't try to erase that, he rerouted it. He preferred stewards who believed that a well-timed settlement pays better than a drawn-out fight. He leaned on intermediaries, such as Johnny Diogardi, Johnny Dio, who assembled paper locals, manipulated elections, and cut sweetheart deals that traded democracy for quiet. The attack that left columnist Victor Riesel blind snapped patience across the city. Dio went from useful to radioactive and ended up convicted in separate corruption and perjury matters. Through that storm, suspicion drifted toward the man behind the curtain. Direct proof remained thin. He had built layers that took heat like fire breaks in a forest. He tested the same template in places where cargo moved by air instead of truck. Idlewild, which the world would soon call Kennedy, ran all night. Pallets on forklifts, customs agents, guard posts, gate passes. Overtime lists meant paychecks. Gate assignments meant money. Friends in the right chairs shaped both. A cart that moved a crate at 9:05 instead of 10:40 didn't look like a headline. Multiplied across a month, it changed ledgers. Brooklyn and Queens crews took posts in Teamsters locals, freight dispatches, and service firms that held keys to the tarmac. The system avoided spectacle. No dramatic robberies, no sirens, just preference for those who understood the program and inconvenience for those who didn't until they learned. When agents drew charts later, the lines converged on patterns, not signatures. He kept politics close enough to matter and far enough to avoid photographs. Campaigns required chairs, halls, cars, food, printing, and people who would show up on a rainy night. He supplied those through friends who liked being helpful. In return, a permit moved, a fine got recalculated, an inspection landed on a day when everyone knew to be ready. He left mayors to their podiums and preferred district leaders, committee secretaries, and agency aides who could pick up phones. If gratitude needed a nudge, he sent a basket or a donation that looked like civic spirit. Other corners of commerce opened when someone whispered, "Sports." Boxing was the obvious one. A patchwork of gyms, managers, promoters, broadcasters, and gamblers. Frank Carbo and Blinky Palermo handled the roughest parts of that market and were convicted on extortion and conspiracy charges by 1961 after televised scrutiny that embarrassed a proud sport. Files placed their circles near his. He stayed buffered. If friends controlled the undercard and the television slot, money would flow through the same canals he trusted elsewhere. He didn't need to be seen at ringside for that to happen. The lesson from those trials reinforced his preferences. Stick to daily necessities and stay off the grand stage. The harshest stress test of his coalition arrived not from prosecutors but from a rival's ambition. Joseph Bonanno, convinced he could shrink the city's decision-making to suit his house, considered a plan that would remove two balancing figures, Carlo Gambino and the polite tactician with the scarred hand. That bid for dominance collapsed into a long feud in 1964. Bonanno vanished for a stretch, his organization fractured, and the wider council enforced a rough equilibrium. During that blaze, Tommy kept to his method. Shorter meetings, different routes, more delegation, no theater. He never gave anyone a clean shot because he refused to draw a bright circle around his own silhouette. Inside his family, he coached managers to be craftsmen, not stars. Anthony Corallo learned to run garment gears as if he were calibrating a clock, earning the Duck's nickname because subpoenas rarely found him face to face. Paul Vario turned a slice of Brooklyn into a dependable web of warehouses, trucking clients, and neighborhood businesses that paid on time. Carmine Tramunti kept gambling calm and loan ledgers tidy. Others handled thin but profitable strips vending, jukeboxes, debris hauling, janitorial contracts that came with access. He rewarded breadth. 30 streams that never made the paper beat one splash that did. Narcotics remained his hard no. He didn't moralize. He calculated. Drug cases invited wiretaps, long terms, and frightened witnesses who turned state's evidence. Yet temptation found men who wanted leaps instead of steps. John Armento's fall on heroin charges proved how quickly that heat could leap fences. Tommy's response was structural and personal. He isolated anyone tempted by that business, kept those contacts far from his core lanes, and made clear that a captain's seat came with expectations about risk he would not bend. He could not repeal human nature. He could protect the routes that paid the rent. His own style rarely drifted. He preferred booths to big tables, the same waiters to strangers, and walks between addresses to phones that could be recorded. He used ordinary stationery for notes that meant little to anyone who found them, and a great deal to the person who received them. He treated staff in restaurants and lobbies well, because people who feel respected keep secrets better than people who feel used. If he offered a stern warning, he delivered it in a tone that sounded like concern. He did not raise his voice. He raised costs for anyone who mistook courtesy for weakness. Law enforcement shifted tactics around him. The 1959 Labora Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, Landrum Griffin, made union fiduciaries more accountable and gave prosecutors tools to pry open crooked locals. The Hobbs Act offered a federal way to frame extortion that affected interstate commerce, which described the garment center neatly. The government combined those with tax law, antitrust, and consent decrees that forced associations to change names and keep new books. He adjusted. He swapped shells, replaced faces, and kept the functions intact, while companies and titles came and went like storefront awnings. The testimonies that turned whispered structures into household terms cut into whatever romance the public had attached to old legends. Joseph Valachi, under oath in 1963, named bosses, explained hierarchies, and told America that the thing some had called a myth was, in fact, a system. He put Tommy on that map as head of a New York family and a participant in the council that settled disputes. The man himself answered the pressure the same way he always had. He appeared when summoned, gave his name, cited his rights, and left. No temper. No quotes. The transcript did the talking with lines like, "I respectfully decline." As years caught up to him, his workday shrank, but his touch did not fade. Illness moved appointments earlier. He leaned more on Corallo and Vario for the weekday grind and on Tremonti to keep numbers clean. He still flipped through ledgers, found a wrong column total with a glance, and wondered why a warehouse's electricity bill had jumped before anyone else noticed the night shift had quietly grown. He still made calls that sounded like congratulations to a steward who had won a small internal election. In fact, a reminder that someone was paying attention. He died in 1967 with the machine intact. The send-off drew family and a mix of men whose business cards carried civic titles and whose real titles lived in notebooks in agents' pockets across the street. There were no speeches about philosophy. There were men who had lived easier because his system removed friction from their days, and there were men who had paid for that convenience in ways they couldn't explain to their accountants. Afterward, Carmine Tremonti took the chair as a caretaker. Corallo, after weathering his own legal storms, would become the heir to the method, a low-profile custodian of unions, trucking, and cargo, whose nickname owed more to discipline than luck. What he left isn't a myth about honor. It's a ledger. Extortion, dressed as labor peace. Coerced membership in trucking associations. Bribes tapped into contracting and inspection. Illegal betting wired into everyday storefronts. Loans designed to keep borrowers on schedule and on a leash. Conspiracies that stitched those elements into a seamless garment no single case could easily unravel. Layered on top were killings from earlier eras that chroniclers and detectives long suspected he sanctioned as policy, even as courts never reached him. He damaged markets, bent unions, warped prices, and made the city's pulse beat to a metronome he calibrated. People later tried to reduce him to a nickname or a single story about a scarred hand and a quiet voice. That misses the craft. He built a business out of ordinary pressures because ordinary pressures are everywhere, every day. He made himself scarce because scarcity shields power. He preferred a list to a speech because lists get finished and speeches get quoted. He moved money in small, constant currents. He carried favors like tools and used them in the right order. Courtesy first, time second, leverage last. In a town that rewards spectacle and punishes it too, he proved that a man with patience can draw a map over a city and then watch for decades as people walk the lines he traced. If you want to see him clearly, look for the moments when a crisis evaporates without a hero, when a truck that should be late arrives on the minute, when a vote produces exactly the tally that a handful of men predicted days earlier. Those are footprints. They belong to a figure who rarely raised his voice, who avoided photographs that could be pinned to a wall, who let other names ride front pages while he sat one room back with a pen, a list, and a memory for small hinges that moved large doors. Snow softens the city's edges. Streetlights blur, sidewalks hush, and delivery bays look like cave mouths glowing amber against the cold. He favors nights like this for certain walks because the city reveals its bones when noise drops. He notes which guard waves a truck through without checking, which foreman lingers with a clipboard too long, which bookkeeper's scarf is new, even though her office just cut overtime. These are small tells, the sort of hints that let him adjust a wheel before it wobbles. He is not chasing drama. He is stewarding a system built to turn timetables into money. His life, counted end to end, becomes a line that runs from Palermo to East Harlem, from a boy's errands to a seat at tables where men divided whole industries. The early pages hold the rough facts. A conviction for auto theft in 1921 that sent him to Sing Sing, a workshop accident that cost 2 fingers and left a signature everyone remembered, a quiet return to the street, with lessons about silence learned hard. He found a home under Gaetano Reina, then under Gaetano Gagliano, and shaped their Bronx and East Harlem circle into an outfit that preferred order to spectacle. In the 1,930 seconds, as New York redrew underworld maps after the Castellammarese bloodshed, he built a reputation for settling problems without adding to newspapers' piles of front pages. Garment work became his laboratory. He learned that a dress is a sequence, not just a product. Control any step, an elevator, a loading bay, a steward's list, and you can influence the price of calm. He packaged calm as labor peace, sold it using intermediaries who knew how to count votes in a union hall and how to write agreements that looked ordinary on the surface, and enforced it with delays that came and went like bad weather. Prosecutors called it extortion and racketeering. He treated it like logistics. Predictable inputs, predictable outputs, quiet profit. He did not leave money on the table elsewhere. Illegal betting ran through candy counters and back rooms, layered so that raids grazed husks while the core kept breathing. Loan money crossed dining tables at closing time, lending to bar owners and small factory bosses who needed cash before banks would even return a call. The rates were punishing. The schedules were strict. When collections went wrong, the tone stayed matter-of-fact. He believed that fear, like a spice, should be used sparingly if you want people to return for the next meal. Labor intermediaries proved essential. Johnny Diagardi's paper locals and election tricks turned bargaining into a market that could be steered. When columnist Victor Riesel was attacked in 1956 and left blind, public anger and official attention hammered the networks Dio had helped assemble. Dio fell to convictions in corruption and perjury cases connected to that world. Through it all, suspicion pointed toward the quiet architect who kept his name off letterhead and his face out of photographs. Responsible histories draw a careful line here. They place Dio's schemes within Tommy's sphere, while noting that direct proof of personal orders for the worst acts never reached a jury. The sports corridor intersected with his orbit because sports is just another business with schedules and narrow gates. Boxing, messy and romantic, carried its own shadows. Frank Carbo and Blinky Palermo used intimidation and secret ownership to steer bouts, control contenders, and skim purses. Senate hearings and federal trials ended with convictions around 1,961, and the story of a captured sport spilled into daylight. Law enforcement files often plotted Carbo and Palermo adjacent to the Lucchese sphere. Tommy's footprint stayed faint. Friends prospered. Television slots appeared. Purses flowed. Yet his caution deepened. He preferred workday essentials over national spotlights. The city's balance at the top turned on alliances. With Frank Costello, he shared a taste for politics and profit without explosions. With Carlo Gambino, he found a twin in temperament. Disciplined, methodical, allergic to noise. Their partnership, sealed in the public eye when his daughter Frances married Carlo's son Thomas in 1962, became the axis that stabilized New York's underworld. They used the commission to set boundaries, fix problems, and price disputes before they became feuds. Together they believed a quiet week paid better than a dramatic one. Pressures never let up. The Appalachian fiasco in 1957 taught every major figure that car convoys and country lawns were obsolete. He avoided that trap and the photographs that followed. The FBI's top hoodlum program put his name on charts. Robert Kennedy's Justice Department tried labor law, antitrust, tax statutes, and eventually conspiracy to reach leaders who stayed off direct crime scenes. The 1959 Landrum-Griffin Act pried open corrupt unions. The Hobbs Act gave federal leverage against extortion in commerce. His answer was repetition. Swap shells, rotate faces, keep functions intact. He made sure that indictments found subordinates with resumes long enough to satisfy a prosecutor, but short enough to be replaced by next Monday. Even subtler was the political dance. He didn't need governors. He needed clerks who managed calendars. He didn't need photo ops. He needed permits cleared on the right day and an inspector who favored discretion over theater. He used small kindnesses, a job lead for a nephew, a parish donation, a scholarship to bind gratitude without writing checks that shouted. The favors returned as phone calls answered and files nudged. This was not cinematic corruption. It was civic grease, guided toward a private ledger. Unsolved killings shadowed the earlier decades, especially during the 1930 reshuffle when Joseph Pinzolo died, and leadership inside the old Reina orbit changed. Detectives and chroniclers assigned suspicion to him for acts that enforced discipline or removed obstacles, and some witnesses privately claimed to know the chain of decisions. Courts never caught him. Evidence thinned when it climbed the ladder. The result is a record full of believed to be alleged and suspected, a vocabulary that frustrates tidy endings and kept him beyond the reach of juries. In the 1,960 seconds, Joseph Valachi's testimony changed the national conversation. Under oath in 1963, Valachi fixed titles to faces, described the commission, and named Tommy as the head of one of New York's 5 families. The revelation was cultural, not surgical. It confirmed years of detective work, but didn't hand over a smoking gun. He reacted by stepping even further from visible places, cutting meetings shorter, and adding buffers between conversation and cash. Narcotics drew a bright line he would not cross. He wasn't preaching. He was calculating. Heroin cases produced long sentences, wiretaps, and informants. John Armento's conviction underscored the risk. Some men chased that money anyway. He isolated them, kept their heat away from garment trucking and the airport, and removed anyone who tried to pipe drug profits through his cleanest lanes. He understood that he could not ban temptation. He could limit its blast radius. Air freight in Queens became the second big canvas for his habits. Idlewild, later Kennedy, operated on a clock that never stopped. Shifts, gate passes, overtime lists, and subcontractors created choke points that echoed midtowns. Paul Vario's circle planted trusted men in spots where a small preference could change a ledger by month's end. They avoided spectacular thefts that invited floods of agents. They pushed for 1,000 small advantages that attracted no headlines. Later, investigations traced patterns among Teamsters locals, freight firms, and warehouse services. The picture looked familiar. Preference, pressure, payments, and a city that kept its appointments. Inside his house, he trained successors who believed in systems. Anthony Corallo, precise, organized, patient, operated the garment machine with the same restraint and came to be known, half admiringly, as Tony Ducks, for his habit of dodging subpoenas. Paul Vario turned Brooklyn and Queens zones into dependable webs of contracts and jobs. Carmine Tramunti, older and respected, kept betting and loan lines in order and would eventually take the chair as a caretaker after Tommy's health failed. He spread risk across capable managers, an engineer's answer to human frailty. Illness narrowed his days by the mid-1960 seconds. Doctors named the tumor and mapped the fight. He shortened meetings, leaned harder on Corallo and Vario for routine, let Tramunti mind the books that needed quiet hands, and still found time to spot a wrong number on a page without needing a calculator. He remained a presence by asking the single question that pointed 3 men toward the fix that kept an entire street humming. He died on the 13th of July, 1967, at home in Lido Beach. The send-off looked like any other quiet suburban funeral until you counted the faces. Family, union figures who owed him careers, businessmen who had never missed a delivery window in years, and cars across the street filled with agents noting plates. Papers printed the Basic's birth in Palermo in 1899, a move to New York around 1911, an early conviction, an accident that made him memorable, decades running rackets that laced through the garment district, gambling rooms, loan offices, and airport freight, and quoted investigators who called him one of the architects of modern organized crime in the city. His machine did not collapse. Carmine Tramunti held the helm long enough to steady the lines. Anthony Corallo later took control and ran the family in precisely the way Tommy would have admired. Low profile, union savvy, and relentless about routine. The world around them changed. In 1970, the RICO statute added a powerful tool that allowed prosecutors to charge leaders with patterns of racketeering instead of chasing single incidents. In the mid-1980 seconds, the commission case put that strategy on display. A federal jury convicted several leaders, including Corallo, of running a criminal enterprise that rested on the very networks Tommy had helped craft: labor racketeering, construction influence, and coordinated control through the commission. The convictions didn't erase his blueprint. They confirmed it by targeting its design rather than waiting for a stray photograph of a single act. Other echoes of his system appeared in headlines he didn't live to see. A later crew from Paul Vario's sphere drew attention for a notorious airport robbery in 1978, the kind of story that would be told and retold in books and films. Investigations and trials around that case were messy. Some suspects died, and years later a man tried for his alleged role was acquitted on the main counts. What mattered for this story is the thread. The airport lanes he had cultivated as a source of steady, quiet preference became places where others, less patient, chased spectacle. The difference wasn't the map, it was the mood. Measure the harm, and you see it not in a single burst but in a drag on everything. Owners paid a private tax for peace, and consumers paid it again at the register. Honest stewards lost elections they should have won. Competitors exited markets they could have served. Workers saw overtime lists tilted by favors they did not understand. City agencies made decisions with a thumb on the scale. His method minimized violence's visibility, which made the damage easier to miss day to day. That subtlety was not kindness. It was craft. What set him apart among men in his line wasn't a legendary temper or a list of bloody nights. It was a mind that treated the city like a system to be tuned. He learned to move the pieces everyone else overlooked: elevators and overtime sheets, gate passes and meeting agendas, phone calls that fixed a problem before anyone named it a problem. He believed courtesy could carry more force than shouting, and that a calendar could beat a gun if what you wanted was money for decades, not a week. The record of his life, filtered through court files, investigative notes, and recollections, lists crimes as categories more than episodes. Extortion dressed as dues, labor racketeering that bent elections, bribery that turned decisions, illegal gambling wrapped in ordinary storefronts, loan sharking that traded on desperation, conspiracies that stitched it together, and suspected lethal decisions in earlier eras that courts never nailed down. Nothing in that list deserves romance. Everything in it explains how he stayed in place for so long. He left few words behind that weren't legal refusals. I declined to answer. On the advice of counsel, silence made him a blank, onto which others projected. His real statements were structural. The trucks that arrived on time for those who paid, the trucks that lagged for those who didn't, the votes that always seemed to land just so, the unremarkable weeks that fattened envelopes. He understood that a city wants to believe it runs on its own. He profited from making that belief feel true while adjusting the small hinges that made it possible. Look for him, and you won't find a manifesto. You'll find the echo of a habit. A man early to meetings and slow to anger. A boss who preferred 3 short sentences to a speech. A planner who measured risk the way a tailor measures fabric carefully, twice, and with an eye on where the seams will fall. He built an organization that could survive his absence because each function was taught, duplicated, and kept beneath the level of spectacle. Others after him would push, err, and sometimes fly too close to light. The design outlasted the designer until a new kind of law finally aimed at the design itself. The city he shaped keeps moving. Garment blocks shrank, then scattered to suburbs and overseas. The airport grew into a hub far larger than the one he once traced with his finger across a window pane. Construction boomed and stalled in cycles he would have recognized. Politics changed accents and slogans. Through those shifts, the lesson he taught about how much power lives in routine remains instructive. The same lesson also warns. When ordinary processes are quietly bent, the damage arrives without alarms. He would have smiled at the idea of a bedtime story about a man who liked lists more than legends. If asked what he wanted remembered, he might have poured coffee and shrugged. The truth is, in the map. A boy from Palermo learned the city's rhythms, broke laws that paid best when no one noticed, and turned human habits' fear of delay, hunger for predictability, respect for courtesy into tools. He left the stage without speeches, leaving behind a framework that paid until the law learned to look for frameworks. If you listen in the hush of a late night, the little breaths between truck shifts, the slow lift of a freight elevator, the click of a dispatcher's pen, you can still hear the kind of power he prized. The power that hides in everyday motion and moves a very large thing by nudging a very small one. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Tommy Lucchese here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet walk through leadership, loyalty, and the art of influence. If this story helped you relax or drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.